There is a zone in western Siberia that does not appear on any active excavation registry. It has a name, a set of coordinates, and a formal protection designation that runs approximately 40 pages in the administrative record. The stated reason is environmental. The boundary lines, however, do not follow the ecosystem. They follow something else, something older than the regulatory framework that currently explains them. I spent a long time with the official account. It is not an unreasonable account. I held it seriously and tried to let it settle. It did not settle. This is what I found when I kept reading. The zones in question are not obscure in the way that most restricted territories are obscure. They appear in federal registries. They have designated names. The Yugra Nature Reserve, the Ugansky Protected Sector, the restricted survey corridors along specific tributaries of the Ob River Basin. These are documented, administered, and in several cases internationally recognized under conservation frameworks that carry genuine scientific credibility. I want to be honest about that. The environmental protection argument for limiting excavation in permafrost-rich Siberian territories is not manufactured. Permafrost is fragile in ways that matter. Disruption of the active layer releases stored carbon, destabilizes surface infrastructure, and damages ecosystems that took thousands of years to reach their current equilibrium. The indigenous cultural argument is equally real. Several of the restricted zones overlap with territories of the Khanty and Nenets peoples, whose land use traditions predate Russian settlement by millennia, and whose legal protections, while imperfect, carry documented institutional weight. These are not pretextual justifications. They are the reasons I held the official account for as long as I did. The problem is a boundary problem. Environmental protections follow ecosystems. They trace the edges of wetland systems, forest transition zones, river corridors with specific hydrological characteristics. Indigenous heritage designations follow cultural geography, sacred sites, seasonal migration routes, burial grounds whose locations are known to the communities that maintain them. When you lay the restriction boundaries for these Siberian zones over the ecological and cultural maps they claim to reflect, most of the boundaries align. The fit is imperfect, as it always is in administrative cartography, but it is recognizable. In certain zones, however, the boundary extends past the ecological edge. Past the cultural boundary, into terrain the stated rationale does not reach. In one corridor along the eastern Ob tributary system, the restriction perimeter extends approximately 60 kilometers beyond the nearest documented indigenous site and 30 kilometers beyond the edge of the wetland complex it is administratively attached to. 60 kilometers is not a cartographic rounding error. It is a decision. I want to be precise about what that observation does and does not mean. Administrative boundaries in Russian federal conservation law are drawn by bureaucrats working with incomplete data, under institutional pressures that have nothing to do with the ground they are regulating. Boundary overextension is common. It happens for reasons of legal caution, for political accommodation of adjacent interests, for simple inertia in how protection maps get revised. I am not claiming the extension is inexplicable. I am noting that the standard explanations for it are generic and the extension itself is specific. It points in a consistent direction. It covers a consistent type of terrain. When I mapped the overextensions across the restricted zones in this sector, they did not scatter. They clustered along a specific latitudinal band running roughly between 60 and 65 degrees north, concentrated in the low-relief terrain between the major river systems, in areas where Soviet-era subsurface survey data is either sparse or formally classified. That classification record is its own layer of the problem. Soviet geological survey programs were among the most systematic conducted anywhere in the 20th century. Between the 1930s and the 1980s, the USSR mapped Siberian subsurface geology at a scale and resolution that has not been publicly surpassed. Those records exist. Many were declassified after 1991. The ones covering the western Siberian lowland sector were declassified selectively. Specific survey corridors, corresponding in several documented cases to areas within or adjacent to the current restriction zones, remain classified under post-Soviet federal resource protection statutes. The stated rationale is strategic mineral security. That is a real category of concern. Russia has legitimate reasons to restrict public access to detailed subsurface data in resource-rich territory. But the classified corridors do not align cleanly with the known hydrocarbon or mineral extraction zones in the region. They align with the overextended restriction boundaries. They occupy the same latitudinal band. They cover the same category of terrain. In 1914, a geological survey team operating under Tsarist Imperial Commission produced a formal report on subsurface formations in the Ob Basin interior. The report is held in the Russian State Historical Archive in St. Petersburg. It was published in a limited scientific edition in 1916 and has not been formally reprinted or digitized in any publicly accessible collection. I was working from a translated summary produced by a Finnish geologist in 1973, which appeared in a low-circulation Scandinavian academic journal and has received in the 5 decades since its publication no formal citations in any indexed geological literature I could locate. The survey team noted in 2 separate passages of the 1914 report that certain subsurface profiles in the low-relief corridor showed geometric regularities inconsistent with the glacial depositional modeling then applied to the region. The lead surveyor was trained in hydrographic methods. He described the inconsistency with the precision of someone who understood what he was measuring and could not account for what he was measuring. He did not elaborate further. The published account absorbed the observation cleanly, without commentary, without any subsequent notation from the institution that commissioned the survey. The 1914 observation did not exist in isolation. That is the thing I kept returning to as I mapped the documented anomalies in this sector. In the late 1950s, a Soviet aerial magnetic survey program covering the western Siberian lowlands produced a series of anomalous readings in the same latitudinal band. The readings were flagged in the internal program documentation, assigned a classification tier that placed them outside the standard geological reporting pipeline, and never appeared in the published summary data released to the broader Soviet scientific community. I am working here from a partial declassification record posted to a Russian Federal Archive portal in 2004, and subsequently removed without explanation, which a Finnish academic institution had archived before the removal. The magnetic anomalies described in that record are not consistent with the hydrocarbon or ferrous mineral signatures that dominate the western Siberian subsurface profile. They occupy a different depth range. They exhibit a geometric regularity that the survey documentation noted explicitly and did not attempt to explain. I am not saying the 1914 hydrographic observation and the 1950s magnetic anomalies describe the same thing. I am noting that they describe the same location. That geographic convergence is either meaningful or coincidental, and I cannot tell you which from the documents I have accessed. What I can tell you is that 2 independent anomalies, separated by 4 decades and produced by institutions with no formal relationship, concentrated in the same restricted corridor, received identical institutional treatment. They were noted with professional precision, filed in records that were either classified or quietly uncirculated, and never formally followed up by any body with the standing to do so. That symmetry is the coordination problem, and I want to be precise about what I mean by it. The Soviet geological establishment and the Tsarist Imperial Survey Commission that preceded it shared no organizational continuity. They operated under different political frameworks, different scientific methodologies, and different institutional incentives. There is no documented channel through which a suppression directive could have traveled from one to the other. I am not proposing one. What I am describing is something that does not require architects. The scientific and administrative establishments of both periods had invested significant credibility in a coherent account of Siberian subsurface geology, one that placed the region's anomalous formations within a stable glacial and tectonic framework developed over decades of systematic fieldwork. Anomalies threatening that framework did not need to be suppressed by decree. They were deprioritized by shared professional instinct, by the unspoken institutional calculus that certain findings cost more than they explain. A note in a classified survey record, a flagged reading assigned to a restricted tier, not erased, never erased, just given no oxygen. The silence organized itself the way institutional silences always do, through shared interest, through the gravitational pull of a framework that no individual scientist had the authority or the incentive to dismantle alone. I need to stop here and name the most important objection, because honesty requires it. The architecture of what I have described rests substantially on absence, on what was not followed up, not explained, not published. Absence is the weakest form of available evidence. An argument built on gaps can always be answered with the observation that there is nothing there, and that answer is philosophically difficult to disprove. I have sat with that objection seriously. I am not claiming exemption from the pattern-finding failure that makes gaps look like shapes when they may simply be gaps. But when I map the unanswered observations in this sector, not just their content, but their precise geographic coordinates, they do not scatter the way ordinary scientific negligence scatters. They concentrate. The overextended restriction boundaries, the classified survey corridors, the 1914 hydrographic notation, the 1950s magnetic anomaly record, they occupy the same band of terrain. Absence with a consistent geographic address is a different category of absence. The formal protection designation covering the core of that corridor was established in its current form in 1992 during the administrative reorganization that followed Soviet dissolution. The agency that drafted the boundary specifications has since been restructured twice. The individuals who drew the specific perimeter lines are not publicly identified in any document I have been able to locate. What the historical record does show is that the corridor had been informally restricted under Soviet resource protection statutes since at least 1963, and that the 1992 formalization preserved the boundary geometry of the Soviet-era restriction with remarkable fidelity, including the 60-kilometer overextension past the nearest documented ecological or cultural designation. Someone in 1963 drew a line. Someone in 1992 kept it. The reason given changed. The line did not. What was a precision-trained hydrographer measuring in that corridor in 1914 that warranted careful notation and then permanent silence? What did a Soviet magnetic survey detect at depth in that same terrain that was classified rather than published? Who drew the first boundary line over that specific stretch of low-relief ground, and what did they already know about what the ground contained? The restriction is still in force. The corridor is still closed. The overextension past every rationale that officially explains it has survived 3 governments, 2 complete reorganizations of the relevant regulatory body, and more than a century of accumulated geological knowledge that has never produced a published account of what is actually there. That is not negligence. Negligence does not hold a specific perimeter for 110 years. Something was known before the knowing was formalized. The boundary is the only evidence of it that was ever left where anyone could still read it.